Hello and welcome to episode 201 of Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty. Of course, I am your host, Rick Doherty. With the holidays approaching, everyone is looking for the perfect stocking stuffers for your friends and relatives. In that spirit, I thought it would be fun to go back and hear from a few authors who were guests on the podcast earlier this year. Maybe one of their books would help you cross everyone off your shopping list. I'll have segments of my interviews with Phil Gramlich, who put together a collection of stories for Walt and His Park, the stories you probably never heard. Ethan Gallogly, who used his time hiking the John Muir Trail as inspiration for his book, The Trail, a Novel. And the husband and wife team of Greg Glasgow and Kathryn Mayer, who wrote Disneyland on the Mountain, Walt, the Environmentalists, and the ski resort that never was. If you're looking to get me something for the holiday season, I take a size XXL in subscribing to the Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty YouTube channel. This month, I'm once again taking part in Vlogmas. I'll have a video vlog or podcast for every day of the month of December. That usually helps us in the YouTube algorithm, and it really helped us jump in subscribers leading into 2024. I really hope that 2025 is the year we take another huge jump in popularity. Let's get things started with my former boss from the travel agency Ear to Their Travel, Phil Gramlich. Thanks for being here, Phil.
Rick, thank you for having me, man. I appreciate it. And how weird is this? How weird is this?
It's very weird. So if anybody wants to know the reason that I have had a podcast for the past 3.5 years, it is because of Phil. I worked for his travel agency, Ear to Their Travel, for a number of years. And Phil has a podcast, and he kept saying to everybody, yo, like, start a podcast, start doing whatever you can, get out there as much as possible. And even once I left because I just got too busy with everything, I still kept the podcast, and I'm so grateful for that suggestion because it's one of my favorite things to do every week.
And you have the voice for it. You sound so much better than I do when I'm talking up there. I'm like, everything I do, like this is like the third one of these I recorded today and yesterday. And I keep hearing other people talking. I'm like, man, you sound so much better than I do, man. But no, I'm happy for you. This is really fun. This is so cool to be able to do this. And thanks again for asking me to come on.
So the book is Walt and His Park, the stories you probably haven't heard. 80 short stories about Walt Disney's life, his dreams, and the creation of Disneyland. So first of all, when I talk about what made me decide to do this podcast, what was it that finally you were like, I got to put together a book? Like, I have these stories and I just need to get them out of me.
Rick, I wish that I could tell you that's how it went, but that's not how that went at all. I was, me, right? I'm always trying, like, what can we do to drum up business? I want to be better. I want more people to know my business exists. So about a year ago in last April, Amy, my wife, and I were talking. I was like, what if, like, I like telling stories. You've hung around with me a few times. You know that I like to tell stories. I never shut up. So I was like, what if I tell a story about Disney every day? Here's where it's very awesome to have intelligent wives like you and I do. Because I said, I'm going to email people a story every day. And Amy thought about it for a minute and she was like, no. And I was like, no, that's really good. And she's like, no, that's really intrusive. And you're going to lose all the subscribers in a day. Don't do that. And I said, all right, well, what about Facebook? And she said, yeah. And I think that's good. So that's how it started. Like, it was like, well, I don't know that I'm a writer. I didn't know. So I just started writing stories on Facebook and people started liking them. And then I started, what worked is I had this whole archive of podcasts that I've done. I've done 450 plus podcasts. And I've talked to, like these crazy Disney celebrities, and I've become friends with some of them. And that it's just like, okay, well, now that the people are listening to the stories and reading the stories, I have 1,000 more. I remember I told my friend Pat, who's been my friend since we were little kids. Literally, we grew up on the same street. 4 years old, we were buddies. He's still my closest guy friend to this day. About 30 stories in, because I told a story a day until the book was written. I tried to. Some days, you can't. But about 30 stories in, he's like, yeah, he texted me. He's like, dude, I can't believe how well this is going. I said, I know. And he goes, you got to slow down there. You're going to start running out of stories. And I was like, oh, I don't think I am. I mean, here we are. I think I've probably told 350 to 400 or 500 of them now. They're all out there for free, by the way. That's the other model that we should kind of talk about. If you want to talk about like don't charge anybody for it until you know that people are going to pay for it. So that's kind of how it all came about.
That's amazing. And like you said, you have stories from some people who are like A-list, Bob Gurr, Raleigh Crump, Julie freaking Andrews.
Crazy one, right?
Where you are able to share these stories when you're trying to figure out what goes in this book and what stories, you tell a story every day on Facebook, but you're trying to say, okay, I want the biggest and the best for this book. What went into that process where you may be more likely to go, well, I got to put something from Julie Andrews in there.
That's that one, right? Like I thought about writing this book and I was like, I want to write it from I want to put this out there into the universe right now, right? You're the first person I'm telling this to. That's not my family. My ambition, my goal, my love is I want to write a Walt Disney movie or a TV show. It hasn't been done and it needs to be done. And I've heard there are scripts everywhere in like the archives. They have them. Just nobody's made the darn thing yet. I want to do that. So that's my biggest ambition. That's what I want to do. And I still want to. I have a storyboard in the other room. I wish I could show it to you. I literally have my scenes on a storyboard. I've been working on it since the book stopped. Since I finished book 1, I started writing book 2 and then working on the movie 2 or a show, whatever Disney wants to do with it. We'll figure, whatever they want to do. But I'll put it on Disney Plus. But the Julie Andrews one, I was going to do this story. The book was going to be just originally from like Kansas City through Disneyland. And I was going to keep it there, like through the opening of Disneyland. And that's what I had originally. And then, because that's the Walt and His Park, that's where that's where the title came from. And then I was like, no, but there's so many more that I can kind of squeeze in. Like the Julie Andrews one doesn't really fit into Walt and His Park, but it's Julie Andrews. You're going to not write Julie Andrews on the cover of your book? Yeah, you are. You're going to do that. You know what I mean? So I couldn't let that one go. But the other one's like Bob Gurr. I was lucky enough. He's just the super nicest. He's just a nice guy. And I got through to his manager and I asked if he would be on my show years ago. You remember these stories because I told you these on in person, and we talked about this on the phone and on our Zoom calls with the agency. Bob was just like very receptive and was like, yeah, I'll tell you all the stories you want. And he like invited me to his house and we sat in the backyard and drank Stella and ate Hawaiian pizza and watched the sunset. And he just told us stories about Walt for like hours. And I was just, it's the craziest, surrealist, nuttiest stuff that I've gotten to live through in the past like decade of my life. I can't even, it's crazy, man. You know how crazy it is. You saw me start.
When you hired me and we had the interview, one of the things that you said to me was, when did you like get the bug? Like, what is it about Disney that, locked you in and said like, this is a big part of my life? Now I'm going to reverse that and ask you, when did that moment happen for you when it clicked? This isn't just a vacation. This isn't just a collection of movies. This is something really important in my life.
Rick, I think it literally was. I was not a Disney junkie until I went to Walt Disney World the first time. And I can't remember the year, 1992. I think I was 13, but sometimes I'd say 12. My sister at 5 years old, I'm going to try to keep this one short, had a brain tumor and had to have surgery to remove it. And my uncle said, my mom's older brother said, when you get through this, I'll take you to Disney World. Before that, 12, 13 years, I didn't even care. I watched the Disney movies, sure. It was a really traumatic thing she went through. She recovered. She's doing great. She's 37, has 2 kids. They're healthy, doing awesome. So don't worry about her. She's fine. She's a pain in my butt. But the thing is, I went to Disney. We went to Walt Disney World. I went to Magic Kingdom. I remember my uncle remember those VHS cameras you would put on your shoulder and it had a suitcase that you had to carry around? So he had that. And I remember filming it. I remember filming Magic Kingdom my first night there. And I remember saying to my mom and dad, I need to know how this place works. What is this? What is this? Why is this here? What the heck? Like, cause I had no concept of how big it was. Like Walt Disney World, if you've never been there and you drive and you're driving for 25 minutes before you find a park, but you're on property, you're like, what is going on? It was just like that sense of like awe and that sense of like, I didn't know how this works and I need to work here. Like, not only just, I want to work here. And I did. 7 years later, I was a cast member. So that's what it was.
So this very much started for you similarly to the way it started for me. My family went when I was a little younger, but it was you went to the Walt Disney World parks and that's when you got hooked on it. But this book is Walt and His Park, not Roy and His Parks.
Right. That's
So
right.
this
Good
is
call.
not about Walt Disney World.
Yeah.
So when did the love of Disneyland come into the picture? When was the first time you went to the West Coast and saw those parks? And what about them made those parks the ones that get the book?
My favorite. It's my favorite. Like Disneyland Park is my favorite. Not only my favorite park, it's literally my favorite place on earth. Like Main Street, USA, at night with the lights on. There's no place I'd rather be. No place. And I think it was the first time I went was my honeymoon. It was our honeymoon. My wife and I, Amy, got married in 2008. And great year, by the way. The Phillies won the World Series that year, right? You remember that?
I do.
Maybe this year too. Maybe this year too. You were 2008. We got married. We went on our honeymoon, and she wanted to go to Hawaii. She'd never been, and Amy's traveled the world. She's been something like 30 countries. Like she's been around. They just did that when they were young. Like my family, we went to baseball games and tried to get season tickets to the Phillies. Her family went to Europe. So she was like, I never went to Hawaii. Nobody in my family ever wanted to go to Hawaii. We need to go to Hawaii for our honeymoon. So I hate flying, which is funny because I own a travel company. But I made a compromise with her. I said, if we're gonna fly to Hawaii, I need to split that flight up we need to do 2 flights and do a couple days at Disneyland in the middle so I can finally see it. I've never seen it. And dude, that was it. I was hooked. I walked in, I went, you know what it was too? I went to the Disneyland Gallery, that's in New Orleans Square. It's no longer there now. It's like the apartment, the dream apartment, whatever. I went upstairs and they had the Robert Olszewski Disneyland Main Street. And I didn't even know I was a miniature nerd, that I love miniatures. And when I saw that miniature in the gallery in Disneyland in New Orleans Square, I was like, not only do I love this place, I'm buying all that miniature stuff. That's coming home with me. And it took me a decade, but I have all of it. I own all of that stuff. So it was that. It was just like being there and just, you can touch what Walt touched. And like for somebody like me, man, that's what it's at. It's important. And it's just, I don't know. I don't know if I'm not a super religious guy, but I do believe in God and I believe in like angels and stuff and all that good stuff. You can feel his presence in the park. You can. I've been in his apartment twice above the fire station, and you can just, there's a feeling in there. Women cry openly.
You can hear the entire conversation with Phil Gramlich on episode 173, which aired back on May 23rd. Right now, we're going to move on to my conversation with Ethan Gallogly, who took his experiences as a hiker to write a fictional account of a man learning to appreciate nature in The Trail, a novel. Thanks for joining us, Ethan.
Thank you for having me, Rick.
You are a backpacker. As people who have been listening to my show for a number of years know, back in 2022, I hiked across Ireland on Ireland's National Famine Way. This is something that I'm trying to do more and more, is get out there in nature, do some more hikes. And you're about to set off on a really big one. So why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I'll just back up a bit. And by the way, that's amazing about Ireland. My ancestry is from Ireland, and I have never been. I intend to go, and I would love to do some kind of trans Ireland hike. I wasn't even aware of that. You got to tell me more about it. That sounds just fantastic. So I've been backpacking for years. I mean, I've been a reviewer for some books on the Sierra Nevada mountains. I've been hiking for over 30 years now. And when I turned 50, I decided to do my longest trip yet, which was 28 days on the John Muir Trail. And I hiked from Yosemite to the top of Mount Whitney, and it was just life-changing. I'd never done a trip with that magnitude or length before. And, out of it came this book on the John Muir Trail, which I was, when I came out, I was just in such awe about everything I'd seen, the people I'd met, just the transformation I went through being out of touch, off the cell phone and in the wilderness for that length of time. It was life-changing. And I wanted to give a talk at the college I was teaching at the time, and I'd scheduled a talk on it. And like, I'm a retired professor. I went and I researched the history and the background of the trail. It was fascinating, and I was all set. And some guy came and took my time spot. Somebody who couldn't do another time. So there I am with all this material, no lecture, and I'm thinking, wow, I've got enough stuff here for a book. This is interesting. And I didn't want to write a book about my trip. I mean, my trip was interesting, but it wasn't, that amazing. I wanted a book that would really attract readers and show people why backpacking and wilderness and time in nature is so important, and also share a little of the history of the Muir Trail that I'd discovered. So I wrote a fictional novel. I created two characters hiking the trail, but I gave them the same itinerary I did. All the places in the book are real. All the kind of people they meet are based on real people I've met out there. And I wove it into a fictional story with the history and the background and some philosophy. And the hero, he's not very likable at the beginning. He's overweight. He doesn't want to go backpacking. He suffers a lot of mishaps and really suffers for the beginning. But he undergoes this amazing transformation through nature and through hiking. And by doing it that way, I think I bring sort of your average reader in, a person who wouldn't necessarily want to be in the woods, can see themselves through Gil, through my protagonist, or I call him my proagonist sometimes. They can see themselves through him. And then I can slowly share through Gil's transformation what it is that's so amazing. And I'm sure having crossed Ireland, about being out there in the mountains. And so that's my book, and that's, it's called The Trail. Very simple. Yeah, it's up on Amazon and Audible. We've got a great narrator. So I mean, and it's been a bestseller on Amazon for over a year now. So your listeners can check that out. But that's what I did when I turned 50. And since then, I've just gotten into this long distance hiking. I've done some crazy things. And I've been working on completing the Pacific Crest Trail now, which is 2,650 miles, last I checked, from the Mexican border to Canada, across, the mountains of the West. So it's a pretty crazy adventure, and I've been working on that.
This isn't a hiking podcast, it's a travel podcast. So I really want to stress, when you do things like this, whether it's a through hike, whether it's a section hike, whether you just find a trail on a day on your vacation and get out into nature, that's hiking as well. And what do you find that you learn, not necessarily just in the hiking aspect, but sort of in the travel aspect, where you get to see things that you wouldn't see normally? You get to interact with people that if you were just visiting these places as a tourist, you wouldn't necessarily interact with them.
Well, that's a perfect question, Rick. And this actually segues very nicely between the previous topic, because I wanted to say exactly, when you're traveling, it's sort of the same thing. You have to stop and reassess sometimes. I've seen people, and I've done quite a bit of international travel, and I've seen folks who are just on this crazy itinerary, just like, you and I were on these trips, where, okay, this morning I've got to go to Notre Dame, and this afternoon climb the Eiffel Tower. And then if we've got time, we're going to go do the catacombs. I'm talking about Paris here. And they've got this itinerary that they just can't bend, where they're stuck on all these sites. And then you run into some interesting thing and you can't stop and absorb it. And you're just stressed out with making all these sites and checklists, and you miss the real experience. I think when you're traveling, you've got to let that go. Yes, you should put one important thing on your itinerary, maybe every other day that you really want to do. But the real experiences traveling are what's in between. you're in a little cafe and you're eating lunch and there's somebody there and they say, you get into a conversation and they say, oh, do you want to come see my village? If you're on an itinerary, you can't do that.
You can hear the entire conversation with Ethan Gallogly on episode 184, which originally aired on August 8th. Finally, we're going to wrap things up with a portion of my interview with Greg Glasgow and Kathryn Mayer, who wrote Disneyland on the Mountain, Walt, the Environmentalists, and the Ski Resort That Never Was. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us. We're so excited to speak with you.
Absolutely. Thanks.
So we focus a lot on different Disney theme parks and different Disney things. And I think there's sort of a graveyard of lost Disney projects all over the globe. In Australia, Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia, there was Disney's America, the theme park that was going to be created. But this is sort of the original killed project from Disney. Before we get to why it didn't work and some of the innovations that still came out of this, what was this going to be?
Absolutely. This was going to be, and when you say the graveyard of Disney projects, what's so interesting about this is because this is Walt Disney himself. So this really was one of the original killed Disney projects, which makes it so interesting because it was so important to Walt. And this was something he really, really wanted. So this was going to be in a place called Mineral King, California. And that place was and is, it was at the time right by Sequoia National Park, right outside of that area. And spoiler alert, now it is in Sequoia National Park. But it was going to be a ski resort, yes, but it was also really going to be this outdoor all year round recreation area. So Walt really envisioned this as a place where people could come. Yes, they could go ski, but they could go hiking and they could bike and they could go swimming and do all kinds of things like that, have wilderness walks. And he really also saw this as somewhere that people could really enjoy that area and basically get educated on the outdoors. Disneyland was great, but it was man-made. This was kind of like a Disneyland, but this was all natural. And there were also going to be other entertainment things that was going to be going on, including there were going to be a movie theater, which of course was going to play the latest Disney flicks, and a number of different fun restaurants and things like that, and some entertainment as well, which also included something that a lot of Disney folks are familiar with called the Country Bear Jamboree. So it was really going to be something, I think, that celebrated the outdoors and celebrated wilderness, but also really entertained people as well. And I think it was going to be one of those places that was just always going to be getting built and built. And, we would kind of see how that evolved later on. But yeah, really kind of this outdoor recreation wonderland, I think.
And that's so interesting. Obviously, I was going to bring up later that the Country Bear Jamboree was originally written, designed, and thought up for this resort in the mountains. And like so many of the canceled Disney projects, we ended up getting something out of it. We got Country Bear Jamboree eventually in Walt Disney World. We had it in Disneyland for a while as well. But, they never seem to let something really die. If they're going to come up with these ideas, they try to continue to preserve them. And that is one of the things that came out of this failed project. What was it that really started the process of the failure of this resort?
Started the process of the failure. I think, one of the big things that happened, unfortunately, was that Walt died just about a year into the planning of this. So it was announced in 1965, Walt died in 1966. And that, kind of threw a wrench into things just because this was such a passion project for him. And because I mean, really what killed this project ultimately was the environmental resistance to it. So there was a big conservation movement obviously happening at the time in the 60s and 70s. And they really spoke out about this development pretty early on, but it really hadn't reached kind of that fever pitch until after Walt died. And that's when it really got bad. And we think that, Walt being Walt maybe would have been able to salvage part of it, maybe would have been able to talk to people on his level and understand the concerns and try to work around them. But some of the leadership that followed wasn't necessarily as committed to the project. I mean, they wanted to finish it for Walt because it was his thing, but they didn't necessarily think it fit into the Disney kind of business model. They said, we're a movie company, we're a theme park company, we don't really do skiing. So that was kind of probably the biggest push. And then once the environmental resistance began with it, I mean, that's what really ultimately caused it to fail.
I would love to get into that environmental resistance at some point, but I think first of all, do you feel that the creation of Walt Disney World, which was happening basically at the same time, and you have the creation of Walt Disney World, which at that point was just called the Florida Project, you have this resort that they're working on in the mountains, and then Walt dies. Was that just too much for the company to deal with at one time, where maybe Walt could have had these conversations, had these, difficult negotiations with environmentalists, but when you're spinning so many plates and the main plate spinner is gone, you just have to start to prioritize a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that, yeah, Walt's death was, obviously it hit the company extremely hard. It was, for the most part, unexpected and very quick, as a lot of Disney people know. And when he passed away, part of the Mineral King idea, in a way, died along with him, because again, this was really his baby. And what's important to note about all this was that Walt considered himself a conservationist, and he really loved the outdoors. He loved wilderness. He loved animals. And this was something like he said numerous times in interviews and in company memos and things like that, that he was so excited about this, like more so than most other projects that he had worked on. He really thought this Mineral King, California area was incredibly beautiful, and he wanted more people to see it because it was extremely difficult to get to, still is to this day. And so this would have made this area really accessible. So this was something that he was so passionate about. So I think when he did pass away, it was just really difficult. And because he had that background as being a conservationist as well, I think that he, again, could have negotiated, could have really calmed down some of these fears that people were having, because this was not lip service. He really was extremely passionate about this. And I think, there were rumblings about some of that environmental pushback. But again, like Greg had mentioned, it really did reach that fever pitch after Walt had died. So it would have been so interesting. And that's one of the sad parts about this story is, what really would have happened if Walt still lived. And I think things probably could have been possibly different.
I'll just add, there was a little bit of a difference between the projects and the fact that in Florida, Disney purchased all the land for Disney World, so they were able to go in and start building right away. In Mineral King, this was land they were leasing from the Forest Service. So the way that this worked was when they first got the rights to build it in 65, they basically had a 3-year planning permit. So they had 3 years to go in, do research, put together an actual final plan. And then that's when they could actually start building. So they didn't really have the means to go in and develop and do a lot of construction and things like that in Mineral King like they did in Florida, which is another, to your point, probably reason why that Florida project got a lot more attention and, dedication at that point, because they could actually start building it as opposed to Mineral King.
And when you talk about some of the questions about would this succeed, both in the public but in the company, because they were a theme park and a movie company at the time. But as you have seen the growth in the Disney company, and now with theme parks like Disney's Animal Kingdom, that's 100% focused on conservation, and the fact that in Florida, they own so much protected land to go along with everything they build. And if they build something new, they have to buy more protected land to make up for it. When you see that they can sort of balance these things now, and they have moved into a resort business model that isn't just theme park resorts, where there's Vero Beach and Alani. So this was really ahead of its time when it came to the Walt Disney Company, because they do a lot of things like this now.
Yeah, it's in a way, it's kind of a shame to think about. I mean, if you go back in time and think when this was happening, 1965, it would have been the second Disney thing. So, when they opened Walt Disney World as their second big project like this, in a way, it sort of locked them in, at least for quite a while, to the theme park business, the movie business. But I mean, think about what would have happened had they opened a ski resort as their second big experiential thing right after Disneyland had opened in 55. So it makes you think. But yeah, I mean, you're 100% right that it's like this project maybe would have spurred them to do resort stuff earlier. I mean, now they're in cruise ships as well, things like that. So it's interesting to think about how much more they could have potentially added more variety to their business model had they done that. And it's interesting, all the protected land in Disney World you're talking about, that all kind of came directly out of Mineral King. There was a kind of environmental council they put together for the Mineral King project to kind of appease some of these fears that environmentalists were having. And they brought those folks in on Disney World as well. And I mean, having seen all the uproar that was happening in California with this ski resort project, they made sure they really paid attention to that aspect of it in Florida.
If you want to check out my entire talk with Greg Glasgow and Kathryn Mayer, you can listen to episode 181, which originally aired on July 18th. All three of these books can be found easily online, but I am not going to plug any individual websites. We will be back with a brand new episode of Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty next Thursday. Until then, have a great week.